Part 2, the web and HTML. The World Wide Web was developed in the early 1990s by Tim Berners-Lee, now Sir Tim Berners-Lee. The basic idea when he developed this was simply to be able to share documents on computers at CERN in Switzerland. And the idea was that we simply had documents which were marked up with hyperlinks, and those hyperlinks could jump you to another document. Now, in fact, there were a number of other things around that did that already. So, for example, if anybody's heard of the Commodore Amiga computer, there was a documentation system for the Amiga called AmigaDoc, and that used exactly that sort of concept of being able to have links to jump you to another document. However, the big difference with the World Wide Web was that the documents could live on a different server. Now, of course, the World Wide Web has evolved hugely since the 1990s, and in the last 10 to 15 years or so, it really has advanced even more with the ability to manipulate things within the web browser itself rather than having to talk to a server all the time. If we look at a typical URL, it's split into separate parts. The first part is the protocol, typically HTTP, that stands for Hypertext Transport Protocol, or HTTPS, which is a secure version of the same thing, so the data are encrypted, or FTP, which is File Transport Protocol, and that is designed for transferring very large data files. The next part is the domain name, so that's the name of the computer that you're accessing. That's then followed by the directory on the server that you're accessing, and finally by a specific file name. Now, if you specify a URL like this, where the last part of the URL is always expected to be a file name, the web server would assume that this was a file you were requesting. It would find that it isn't, and then try again, assuming that what you're looking for is actually a directory. And if you did it this way, putting the slash on the end, it would know that it is indeed a directory. And when you specify a directory without specifying a file name, then it defaults to looking for something like index.html usually. Now, in the first part we talked about markup languages and looked in particular at XML, but the markup language of the web is HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language. Now, HTML was actually designed before XML and was inspired by another language called SGML, which is Standard Generalized Markup Language. So SGML was standardized as long ago as 1986. It's a really rather complex standard for document markup and only used by a few very large companies and research organizations these days. Really, pretty much everything else has switched over to XML. Now, in HTML, just as in XML, markup consists of tags. We have start tags, which are between the angle brackets, the less than and greater than. We then have some content of the tag, and that may include nested tags. And then we have a closing tag, or end tag, identical to the opening tag, but has less than slash instead of just less than, and that shows that it's a closing tag. So let's look at some examples. The following would indicate a piece of text to be set in bold font. So we have a tag at the start indicating that it's bold, and a closing tag indicating the end of the section that needs to be marked up in bold. As with XML, tags may contain attributes, and this is a type-value pair contained within the opening tag. So this is the A tag, which is really the thing that makes the World Wide Web. The A stands for anchor, which seems a little bit random, but this is how you specify a link. So in this case, the link would be the text My Bioinformatics page, and the href attribute and its value give you the link to another page. Some tags don't require an ending tag. So HR produces a horizontal rule, and the tag is started with a less than and should be ended with a /greater than. Now, as I mentioned, the older web standards are not fussy about these sorts of things, so you could just do less than HR greater than. Now, the original HTML standards were really very forgiving. They allowed for missing end tags, so for example, you could just separate paragraphs using a P tag without a closing tag. I said with XML how inaccurate nesting was not allowed. Well, in the web standards it was. It allowed attributes without values, and it also allowed the attribute values to be there without inverted commas around them. So all of these things meant that the HTML standards were not the same as XML. They were not compatible with XML. HTML version 4.01 led to the development of something called XHTML. And this standard is now based on XML and therefore much more strict. So it used all the same tags and things that earlier versions of HTML used. Because it was now XML, it enforced all those things that are required by XML. So things like every opening tag must have a closing tag, and all of these tags are case sensitive. If you have a tag which doesn't have a closing tag, then you use this syntax where it's called a self-closing tag. You have a slash before the greater than. Nesting must be correct, so this would be illegal. So B stands for bold, I for italics, and then we're closing the bold and closing italics. That would not be allowed. You have to have the italics being closed before the bold. Attributes must have values, so something like this is now illegal. Instead, you'd have to do something like that, and depending on whether the value is actually important or not, that may be somewhat redundant, but in some cases you do need to have a real value in there for an attribute, depending on what this attribute does. Attribute values must also be in inverted commas, either single or double, it doesn't matter, so this would be illegal. HTML5 is the latest standard, and the care that's required for doing XHTML, in other words making sure that opening tags match closing tags and so on, is still recommended for HTML, but unlike with XHTML, it's no longer required. HTML introduces a lot of new things, new functionalities for structuring content, support for audio and video within the standard so that you don't have to use external software, external plugins to create videos and so on. It contains support for geolocation, vector graphics, drag and drop of files, and so on and so on. It also allows multiple storage options, so HTML has always allowed you to store cookies, but HTML5 allows things like SQL databases for storage as well. And it has improved communication between the server and the web browser, and within the web browser it supports multiple threading, which allows JavaScript to run in separate threads from the display of the web pages. So there's a URL here at the bottom which gives you a sort of analysis of the difference between standard HTML, HTML5 and XHTML. So although the recommendation these days, really, if you're learning anything more advanced with web programming, is to use HTML5, for the purposes of what we're going to do here, we're going to stick to all those requirements for XHTML, because these are all compatible with and recommended for HTML5, even if they're not required. Let's have a look then at the most useful HTML tags. You've already seen a couple of them in the examples that I've given. The first is the HTML tag, which wraps around the whole of the HTML document. And within that, we have a head tag, which defines things that relate to the document, but are not things that are actually displayed. So things that are kind of meta information about the document. So one example would be the title. And the title, which is placed within the head tag, produces the title that goes in the top of the browser window. After the head, we have the body, and that contains all the HTML relating to what actually appears on the page. Within the HTML that's going to appear on the page, so the stuff that's within the body tags, we have a number of different things, and the first of those that we're going to look at is the heading tags, so H1 through to H6, which give headings and subheadings. By convention, it's not required, but conventionally people only put one H1 tag on a page, and that's the main overall title for the page. And then we can have these other lower level headings which are produced in smaller fonts. P is used to enclose a paragraph of text. So if we're going to stick with the XHTML type of standard, then we must make sure that every opening paragraph tag is matched by a closing paragraph tag. We've already seen this one. This is the anchor tag, which allows us to create a hyperlink to another page. Now, the URLs that we specify in here may be absolute or relative. So an absolute URL is one like this, which starts with http:// and then gives a web server and page which is giving you the domain name of that server. We can also have internal absolute URLs, so like this second example, so this will always start with a / pages / index.html means go to the top of the set of web pages that we have on this web server, find the pages directory, and then the index.html file within that. And then thirdly, we have just page.html, which is another page in the current directory. And if we wanted to step down to a directory below, we could have directory name / and the file name, or we could go up a level with .. / and then a file name or a directory name, and then a file name, and so on. So we can navigate around the tree of files in the web directory just as we could if we were stepping around using the command line. The next tag, img, is used to specify an image, and here we're specifying this image called image.gif. So we specify the source of the image, and that's the file name, and this is one of these self-closing tags because we don't have any body to the tag, so there's no closing tag. Instead, it's a self-closing tag with a / and a greater than. And we can add extra attributes like border = 0, because the default is actually to draw a thin line around an image. A couple of other self-closing tags. BR is used to force a line break, so that would be within a paragraph generally. And HR displays a horizontal rule. We can also specify a width attribute to the HR tag. So in this case, width equals 50% would mean that the rule would be centered on the page but take up only half of the width of the page in total. Another very useful thing is to be able to create a table, and that's done with 4 different types of tag: table, table row, table header and table data. So here we're starting a table and ending a table, and we've got 3 rows within that table. The first row contains 2 table headers. The second row and the third row both contain 2 table datas. And the sort of output that you would get from that would be that the table headers would be styled somewhat differently, perhaps in bold, and the data would be in a normal font. Another useful tag is the pre tag. So this is used for pre-formatted text. So in this example, normally with other tags, line breaks are completely ignored. So all this would just appear on a single line. By using the pre tag, you will get a typewriter type font like Courier, and the layout will be exactly as it appeared here. So that's useful for things like code, things like sequences, anything like that that you wanted to display on a page, and you wanted to have that mono-spaced font, and you wanted to be able to put in line breaks. A few others for markup of text: B for bold, I for italic, TT for producing teletype or monospaced font again, and U for underlined text. We can also produce lists, and we can have either unordered lists, which is UL, or ordered lists, which is OL. So OL and close OL or end OL, and then within that ordered list we have list item, LI, piece of text, and end list item, piece of text, end list item. And it's exactly the same with an unordered list, except we're using UL instead of OL. And the output from that, for an ordered list, it would be numbered, and for an unordered list, it would be bulleted. We can also nest lists, so within a list item, we can have another unordered or ordered list. Now, we can also specify the font. So we can encompass a section of text with font, face equals, and then the font that we wish to use, the size, and the colour. Now here we actually have a list of different fonts, because remember that the web needs to be platform neutral. So some people might be using a Mac, some people might be using Windows, some people might be using Linux, and so on. So we can specify a list of fonts in order, and this means use Helvetica if we've got it. If we haven't, use Arial, and if we haven't got that, use the default sans serif font. So a sans serif font is one like this, which doesn't have little kind of fancy wiggly bits on the end of letters like F and so on. Now, although we do have this font tag, its use these days is strongly discouraged, and we will see how we get round that in the third part of the lecture. Now here's a simple web page, and I'm going to take you through the tags that have been used to create this. So this one is an H1, heading level 1. This is a heading level 2. This is a paragraph, but I've added in an attribute of align equals right to push it over to the right hand side of the page. Again, that's one of these things that these days is discouraged. This is in bold. This is a hyperlink. Now these two are both headings of level 3. This is actually 2 paragraphs. This is in italic. Then we have a table here. This is a table row, table headers, and one of the 4 items of table data. And finally, this bit here is being done in a teletype type of font, so that uses TT. So here is the actual code that produced that page. One other thing that I didn't mention is that we had a horizontal rule here between the kind of header section and the more data part. So you can see here that was the horizontal rule. Now the other thing you might notice on here that is slightly odd is when I used those tags that I was describing. Let's just go back to the previous slide. That was here, this HTML, which I did with the TT around it. We have a little bit of a problem because we wanted to be able to display those less than and greater than signs, and those are the special symbols that are used for markup. And therefore, we can't use them in a piece of text. What we do instead is use what's known as an entity reference. And this is a little string which always starts with an ampersand and ends with a semicolon. And there are then letter combinations that allow us to display a whole range of special symbols, LT for less than, GT for greater than, and so on. And of course that in itself creates a problem because we've used the ampersand for something special. So if we want to display an ampersand, we have to do ampersand AMP semicolon. Now, I mentioned a number of times that some of the things that I showed you are these days discouraged. And in the third part of the lecture, we will look at how we should be doing these things and how we can start to separate the content of the page from how it's actually displayed.